Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to the May 4th meeting of AAHGS Nashville. We're happy to have each and one of you in person and online. My name is Natalie Bell. I am the program chair for the organization. Tania Kuntz is our president. She will be speaking from online, and we have a number of participants who are online as well. Just want to open up by reminding everyone the AAHGS mission is we're the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. We are a nonprofit which strives to preserve African ancestor family history, genealogy, and cultural diversity by teaching research techniques and disseminating information throughout the community. I would like to just say that the last couple of meetings, we've been talking about the Civil War in America. We've had a couple of speakers. Mr. Gary Berg, of course, is with us here today, who is the face and voice of Fort Negley. Fort Negley being where we are situated here in this meeting this morning. So happy to have you, Gary. And we have, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people. And in terms of the Civil War, why is it still important? The United States, as we know it today, is a result of the Civil War. It was fought over conflicting issues of liberty. The cost was high, but the war resolved many issues that divided the nation. At that time, of course, a lot of those issues still remain. And I just wanted to remind you all that here in Nashville, we consider ourselves the cradle of the civil rights movement from the Civil War to civil rights. I might mention just briefly, we had a fresh start to a key civil rights moment here in Nashville a couple of weekends ago. The plaza in front of the courthouse was named for Diane Nash. I thought it was a pretty significant moment, and I thought it would be appropriate to share that with you all this morning, to know that we've had so much civil rights history here in Nashville, and we're so proud to know that we're keeping it alive. And one person who is doing yeoman's work keeping our civil rights history alive, in particular Civil War history to civil rights, is Dr. Angela Sutton. She's going to be our featured speaker this morning. Very, very excited to have her here this morning. She's been with us for a long time, and in fact, she introduced us, AAHGS Nashville, to Fort Negley. So I do have an introduction, but I want to defer to Tania to see if she has some opening statements that she wants to make.
Thank you, Natalie. I just want to say hello and welcome to everyone who is there with us in person and those of us who are online. I wish I could be there in person. It's so good to see some familiar faces back in the room. So hello to everyone there. And Natalie's done a good job of just opening up the meeting and welcome you to the session and the topic. So I don't feel like I need to say much. Just wanted to do a quick welcome, and we're excited to hear from Dr. Sutton this morning as she shares about her work. So Natalie, please go right ahead and continue with what you were planning.
Well, we started this journey with Dr. Sutton, I guess about 3 or 4 years ago, back when there was a threat of development of Fort Negley. And she joined in the community support for preserving the fort in a very strong and continuing way. Angela Sutton is the Assistant Dean for Graduate and Education Affairs at Vanderbilt University. She is a social and digital historian of the Atlantic world, interested in the tools and methods that preserve and widen access to the sources that help refine and redefine popular understandings of American slavery and its modern consequences. She's the director of the Builders and Defenders database. She's going to bring us some updated information about the database. It's so key and vital to accessing the African American history of the Civil War in Tennessee. So that we're so pleased that she has chosen this as a project, and she's done so well with it. Excuse me, in addition to the database, which, by the way, was funded in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as the National Park Service. I want to say that, excuse me, she has a documentary that she's now working on. This lady is on the ball, and she's putting Nashville on the map. African American history, 19th century African American history of Nashville. So the documentary, I believe, is going to be previewed during Juneteenth. Are going to be screened during Juneteenth here at Fort Negley. That's on June 19th. That is just exciting, just exciting. She's working with the African American Cultural Alliance on that. The Friends of Fort Negley is also a partner in that. So all of these organizations are our partners as well in working with Dr. Sutton to use the database and to create narratives about the early African Americans. They were escaped slaves. Some of them were taken from their masters, but they were people who were seeking liberty. And she's given them their names. We have their stories. We have to find their stories and document their stories. So without further ado, Dr. Sutton, I know it's going to be a fabulous presentation. So everybody give her a hand.
Oh gosh, thank you. That whenever people give such wonderful introductions, it always makes me really afraid for if I can live up to all of those promises. I'm going to share my screen now. If I can. Oops. Can I? Here we are. This one. All right. All right. Can everybody on Zoom see the presentation?
Yes, we see it. And so when you hit the present button, it should go full screen.
Okay. Wonderful. All right, that is what I want. All right, so thank you again for that wonderful introduction and for allowing me to come here. I have so many things to share, and one of the things that I've really appreciated about working with AAHGS, and there are many, but I'm sorry, I can demask for this one, that'll be easier. So one of the things that I've really appreciated about working with AAHGS, but also among many things, is that it has really helped me to think about what kind of a scholar I want to be and what kind of a person I want to be and how I want to move with the knowledge that I have. So when I first came to study history at the graduate level, I was really interested in pirates. That was like my big thing. In fact, when I was a child, I really wanted to be a pirate. That was my lifelong dream until my grandmother told me I should probably just be a dentist instead. Which is not for me. But I found a way to sort of embrace the things that I was crazy about by studying piracy in grad school. And while I studied piracy in grad school, I noticed that there are so many scholars who focus on how awesome it is to be a pirate, because they all want to be pirates too, all of us. We all wanted to be pirates when we were little. But almost nobody was focusing on, what do those pirates do in Africa? Because what are you doing in Africa? Like what are white people doing in Africa in the 1700s, right? Like nothing good, nothing good. And so I began to look into that. I was so curious, like why did pirates flock to West Africa? What were they doing there? What were the consequences for Africans, for enslaved people, for the rest of the world? How did that affect everything? And so when I began to do that study, I learned so much. And of course, I stopped wanting to be a pirate once I learned what they were doing, right? You have that Bob Marley song, the Redemption song, right? Pirates, yes, they rob I, take I to the merchant ship. And I realized, like, I don't want to be a kidnapper. Like, I'm not going to idolize that. I'm going to tell the truth about what I see in the documents. And that's where this book came from. And so I'm going to read you the introduction. It's really short of the book and kind of talk a little bit about what I discovered when I did that research. And then we're going to connect it to how the things that I learned about documents about enslaved Africans, how that translates to the way I do my work here in America. So like, how did I come from studying Africa to studying the United States? And why I do that, and how that looks, and some of that sensibility like that I bring to the database that we created, the Builders and Defenders database. So then I'll take you through the database and kind of show you what we have there, how we know what we know, what documents we use to build it. And then we've got little pamphlets here that Natalie is going to share around. And we're really looking for your feedback on those pamphlets because we want to create something like it's a partnership between Vanderbilt and AAHGS and Fort Negley parks. And we really want to make sure that the information we're giving out to people who want to learn more about the Black people who built here and who fought here is the most accurate and also the most accessible to other people who may be descendants of the space. That's really important to us. So please do take a look at that. And then at the end, I can sell a few books. They're $25 a piece. Please do not feel obligated at all. It's not a problem. You can also buy them online if you prefer. They're actually a little bit cheaper on Amazon right now, $21. So if you have an account there, you might want to prefer to purchase them online. That's cool too. So yeah, I'll get started. All right, here we go. All right, so the introduction is called Gentlemen of Fortune. And I'm reading from the book Pirates of the Slave Trade, The Battle of Cape Lopez, and the Birth of an American Institution. And of course, in this case, the American institution is slavery, right? Our oldest and our biggest and most lucrative institution. In January 1722, a fleet of more than 200 pirates strong boldly followed Captain Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts' flagship, the Royal Fortune, into Ouida Harbor, a neutral African slave trading port with international presence in what would become coastal Benin. There, the pirates forced the kidnapped musicians on board to play louder as they rounded up nearly a dozen slave ships anchored in the harbor. The captains of those ships, who were on land negotiating for enslaved captives, watched from the shore with wary eyes as their crews on board the ships surrendered one by one, rather than face death. When the captains rowed to the pirates to negotiate for their ships, the pirates extorted them. The captains could either pay 8 pounds of gold apiece to get them back, or they could watch their ships burn right there in the harbor. To show them he meant business, Black Bart ordered his pirates to coat the decks with pitch to ensure a quick and all-consuming flame. The captains agreed to pay. By this point, Black Bart's fleet of pirates had taken over 400 ships, assassinated a governor, and caused tens of millions of damage in today's US dollars. As they terrorized the coast of West Africa, they brought the Atlantic slave trade to a standstill. Although 8 pounds of gold was an exorbitant amount, even for the captains in the Atlantic slave trade, it's not like the money was theirs. It belonged to the companies in Europe that had sent them. Seeing how pirates had destroyed so many ships already, the captains figured the shareholders of these companies might prefer to lose the gold than the time it would take to build replacement ships. To avoid accusations of pocketing the sum and to facilitate the insurance reimbursement process for the slave ships, the captains asked Black Bart on the Royal Fortune for a receipt to take back home. The pirate captain joined his crew in a roar of laughter and then realized the slave traders were serious. He shrugged and picked up a quill, pressed his tongue into his cheek, and created a note for each ship owner back in Europe to assure them that their captains had indeed been extorted by the, quote, gentlemen of fortune. As soon as the pirates collected the gold, they headed south to Cape Lopez in modern-day Gabon. The estuaries there were perfect places to refresh their ships, count their winnings, and stay out of the watchful eye of the fanatical British naval captain who had been hunting them for more than a year and a half. Captain Challoner Ogle was in charge of 2 men of war, the Swallow and the Weymouth, and tasked by the king himself to do whatever it took to end this trade to British shipping in Africa. British settlers in the Americas demanded enslaved Africans at far higher rates than British slave traders could traffic them. and settlers of other empires in the Americas echoed these sentiments. The first European nation to solve the pirate problem could emerge as the next global superpower. Both the English and the Dutch clamored for this coveted position, and each bemoaned that the state of West Africa was keeping them from it. So in 1721, competitive chaos characterized the Atlantic slave trade in Africa. The number of participants in the trade had fostered a culture of competition that rendered it inefficient and financially precarious. Nearly 1 in 3 slave ships fell prey to piracy. In addition to that, illness, revolts, and insurrections also could wipe out an entire year's profit margin. Because of this, the coast of West Africa was essentially a free-for-all, with the royal and official trading companies of enslaving European nations complaining greatly about one another, as well as about the independent traders and pirates who operated there. Under Black Bart's visionary nihilism and aggressive recruiting, the numbers of pirates on the West African coast had grown exponentially. Slave ship captains lived in fear of attack. Often their ships were looted, damaged, stolen, or burned, and the enslaved on board were freed, or murdered, or resold, or coerced into piracy to prey on other slave ships. Many, of course, didn't have to be coerced. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1714 and the new war on piracy had created swaths of jobless former privateers and other maritime laborers who were often impressed into work on board slave or naval ships of various European empires for a pittance. Both were dangerous, violent jobs that few people took on voluntarily. The Atlantic slave trade had created a culture of precarity and danger in West Africa and the waters surrounding it. The steady influx of European slave traders operating with skeleton crews and the weapons that they brought as gifts transformed the human geography of the coastal states and the surrounding waters. Increasingly, those Africans who refused to work with the Europeans were in danger of being sold into the trade themselves. Wars of conquest by both the emerging Ashanti and Dahomey empires to the north created large numbers of refugees and captives being marched to the coast. This, in turn, attracted more human traffickers from Europe who introduced further violence. This stew of desperation helped to create the conditions for the third wave in what historians refer to as the golden age of piracy. Black Bart and his pirates were no ordinary sea robbers. They were a nihilistic fleet that descended upon the African coast like locusts, consuming every ship within view. As their ranks swelled, they committed unthinkable feats, like utilizing exploding ships filled to the brim with gunpowder as weapons against other ships, or even against harbors and forts. Until this moment at Ouida, Black Bart's pirates had evaded the British Navy, leaving a trail of burned and scuttled or partially sunken ships, like a trail of breadcrumbs for them to find. At Cape Lopez, their fortune finally ran out. On February 10th, 1722, Captain Ogle found the pirates at long last and defeated them in battle. He sold the pirates of African origin into the slave trade, and those of European ancestry he subjected to what amounted to a kangaroo court, in which the majority were sentenced to death. Back in Europe, the shareholders of the major slave trading companies cheered on these deaths, optimistic that the slave trade would soon pick up again. So Bartholomew Roberts has been the subject of so many books, but almost all of them end with his death. I wanted to place him into a story where we don't usually find him, so his death appears in the middle of this book and serves as the beginning of an entirely new story. He belongs to the world of the 18th century and its attending earth-shattering transitions. This century saw a global paradigm shift. The Atlantic world transformed from one full of precarity and possibility toward one in which colonial extraction models calcified and shut down many of those possibilities. The Battle of Cape Lopez becomes a way to see what the Atlantic world looked like before chattel slavery became inevitable and to investigate the legacies of this inevitability. With the threat of Black Bart's fleet neutralized, Great Britain's slave trade did indeed boom. Safe from pirate attack, traders raced back to the coast to make their fortunes. After the Battle of Cape Lopez, English slavers like Captain William Snelgrave, who had been captured by the pirates in 1719, returned to find the slave trade profitable beyond their wildest dreams. New investors flocked to Britain's slave trade, looking to make a fortune. With Britain's slave trade now booming in West Africa, the Netherlands were in danger of being cut out of the slave trade almost entirely. And with the pirates gone, the largest, most obvious threat to the Dutch West India Company's trade was the Gold Coast king by the name of John Conny. His trading practices at the Prussian-built castle of Fort Great Fredericksburg at Cape Three Points had sustained the pirates that attacked British shipping and had brought the profits of the Dutch slave traders down to 20% of what they once were. He entertained anyone willing to trade, and his formidable Prussian fortification, his sizable army, and his decades of experience dealing with slave traders of both Europe and Africa gave him the upper hand. This allowed him to spark bidding wars and manipulate the trade in his favor and in the favor of his people, the Ahanta. One by one, he poached the customers of the Dutch West India Company and encouraged their competitors. In 1724, the Dutch and British teamed up for their second joint effort to destroy him, with mixed results. The inland trading partners in Ashanti-land avoided the people who had driven away their ally, John Conny, and trade routes between the interior and the coast reconfigured, once again endangering Dutch shipping while favoring British trade. With both Black Bart and John Conny defeated, few obstacles remained to West Africa's slave trade. The number of enslaved Africans that were pulled out of the continent increased from roughly 40,000 in 1720 to 60,000 after 1724. By the 1760s, that number would swell to more than 90,000 enslaved captives embarking from West Africa every year. These figures form the start of an exponentially increasing trend that saw the enslavement and the transshipment of millions. The Battle of Cape Lopez represents the moment in time when the British slave trade picked up steam and, more importantly, allowed the British chattel model to proliferate here in the Americas. So something that very few people know is that prior to the 1722 battle, in the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries, many different forms of enslavement existed in the Atlantic world. Most European empires implemented systems of slavery in the Americas that were modeled on that of the Roman Empire. Under this model, enslavement was a state of being and not a permanent identity. People enslaved under models inspired by the ancient Romans were legally considered persons and remained eligible to claim a more truncated set of human rights while they were enslaved. The chattel system, made popular by the British Empire, attempted to strip personhood from the enslaved. Chattel slavery allowed African and Afro-descended people to be considered the legal property of an enslaver. This type of slavery legally rendered enslaved people as objects that could be owned and forced the children born of enslaved women to become objects possessed by the enslavers in the eyes of the law. Chattel slavery created a pernicious system of race and racism from which America and the world still struggle to disentangle ourselves. Prior to the Battle of Cape Lopez, the areas in North America that would become the United States were divided between the Roman and the chattel models. And this created some very important distinctions. So you can see on the map here, this is one of the older maps, and you have the French Louisiana territories in yellow, you have Spanish territories in red, Spanish Florida, and a little further up. And then you have the British English territories on the East Coast, right? So those were three different models of enslavement that occurred here in the US. And the British model, which is in the green, that's where chattel slavery was practiced most often and most violently. And in the red and yellow, you had a mixture of Roman and chattel. And so there was much more possibility because enslaved people were not necessarily considered objects there. Prior to the Battle of Cape Lopez, the areas in North America that would become the United States were divided. This created some very important distinctions. People enslaved in the areas colonized by Spain and France, so Spanish Florida and Texas, as well as the French Louisiana territory, still were subject to systems inspired by the Roman model. The people who had been enslaved in territories formerly claimed by the Dutch and Swedish, which is not part of this map, but that was in the Northeast where New York and Manhattan are, and Vermont as well. They had also been subject to Roman-derived forms of enslavement. Chattel slavery, on the other hand, was the most common form of enslavement among the British North American territories, green. As the British slave trade expanded, so did the British chattel model in the Americas. So for a nation like the United States, with a history of colonial Spanish, Dutch, Swedish, French, and British occupation, this means that incredibly complicated and diverse experiences of enslavement slowly gave way to the overarching model that we know today. Places in what would become part of the United States navigated the chattel system for the first time. Opportunities for the enslaved and their descendants rapidly dwindled as settlers of European descent enshrined their objectification into law. So this book is the story of the Battle of Cape Lopez and how the defeat of the pirates put into motion a series of events that would forever shape the culture of enslavement in what would become the United States. It traces the stories of three prominent men in West Africa: the pirate captain Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts, the British naval captain Chaloner Ogle, and the Ahantan king John Coney, plus William Snelgrave, the legacy slave trader to Jamaica and Virginia. Snelgrave wrote vividly horrific descriptions of the slave voyages he piloted before and after the Battle of Cape Lopez, which provide a way to track change over time in the culture of the slave trade in West Africa. Though the battle happened 54 years before the United States claimed its statehood in the Declaration of Independence, it shaped the type of nation that we would become. It boosted British involvement and profit in the Atlantic slave trade to create an overseas empire that was a true slave society, a society upon which all politics, religion, economy, labor, and social identities depended on the chattel enslavement of Africans and their descendants. At Ouida, the gentlemen of fortune facetiously referred to themselves as gentlemen, with tongue-in-cheek wordplay. Black Bart had named his flagship the Royal Fortune, and he and his pirates on board had literally extorted the slave traders for a small fortune. But ultimately, he knew that by doing this, he was going to die, and that his men would hang by his side. Together, they decided that if they couldn't live on their own terms, that they would die by them instead. A merry life, but a short one, had been their motto all along, after all. So then, dear readers, I invite you to read on, and with every chapter to ask yourselves, who were the real gentlemen of fortune here? And where is the legacy of that fortune today? Thank you. All right, so this slide here I put up so you could get a feel for how I figured out what to put into the book. Like, these are the documents that I used.
One moment, Angela, if I might. We're not seeing your slides full screen.
Oh no. How do we full screen them?
Presentation. See. I may have to get
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let's figure that out.
Okay. So maybe if you stop sharing, Donald, and then share again, you can change whether it's presenter view or not.
Okay. What's that, Tania?
Hit stop sharing the presentation. Hit the stop share button.
Okay.
Right. Now try sharing again. And
Okay.
it may give you a choice of what you want to share.
Green 2.
Okay. How is this?
Yes. Yes. That's it.
Is that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that.
Yeah, so you were referring to a map, and if you could show the map again and highlight those areas, that might be helpful.
Sure. All right, so. All right, can you see that?
Oh, I just see archives and sources page.
No, it's, okay. Maybe it's, because we have multiple, is it this one? Okay, yeah.
Okay,
Here.
yes, that's it.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, so this is the map, and of course, it's not.
Okay.
Back then, the way Europeans looked at map making, it was a practice that was half artistic, half scientific. They didn't quite figure out like the lines. So like this is absolutely not accurate, but it just gives you an idea, right? Like so you have the Dutch and the Swedish slave traders ended up colonizing parts of New York and Vermont, which is not shown on the map. And then you have the British, who had the 13 colonies, which are along the eastern seaboard, right? Our original 13. And then you have Spanish Florida and Spanish Texas as well, which is in Florida, but also the southern half of Georgia and Alabama and some of Louisiana as well. All of that was considered Spanish Florida. And in fact, that territory line was disputed. So if you ask Spain versus if you ask France versus if you ask Britain, they all have a different idea where those lines are, of course. And they fought over them. And then, of course, you have in yellow the French Louisiana territory, which again you can tell this map does not favor the Spanish because the Spanish would have considered Texas to be theirs and not to be France's, right? So like there's a bit of dispute, but it just like helps you kind of envision that in what is the United States, to begin with, only a small part actually followed British chattel slavery, and the rest of the country had mixed models that came from the Roman interpretations of what slavery should be. Because, you know, like in Europe, we look into our past, and into our past, the slavery that we have all comes from Rome. So that's the model we carried forward. Sorry, I say we because I was born in Germany, my mother's German. I don't know, it doesn't come through in my accent, but I spent most of my childhood in Germany. And so that's how I can do this research because my language skills, I grew up speaking German, and then Swedish and Dutch are very similar to German. So that's how I was able to do this research. All right. Was there anything else that y'all needed to see? We just had some information about John Connie. There's the slave trade, and Challoner Ogle, the British slave hunter, pirate hunter, and this is the pirate Black Bart and Ouida, and those are the slave ships there in the harbor, and Black Bart's 2 pirate ships in the foreground. All right, so now I will move on to the sources, which probably is one of the more exciting things to talk about, at least for me and you, not for most people. But so these sources, I wanted to talk about them because, as you can see from the list, I only looked at sources that were created by European people. And I only saw those sources in Europe. They exist in European archives pretty much only. And that means that if you are a researcher in the United States, you can't do this research unless you have the ability to go to Europe for a year or more to sit and look through all of those records, which is a ludicrous thing to ask somebody to do. I mean, I'm so privileged that I was able to do it. Vanderbilt paid for me to do this, but it's a ludicrous way to do history because most of the slavery that Europeans commissioned happened here. Yet we can't access those documents unless we have someone that we pay to educate for multiple years and then pay to spend a year in Europe, right? That is not a tenable model, that's a colonial model, and I hate it. But more than that, when you look at what's in those sources specifically as well, these sources are created mostly by human traffickers that come out of Europe. Their whole entire purpose is to go into Africa, to buy kidnapped people, to put them onto ships, to bring them here to the Americas, and to force them to work themselves to death, right? That is it, that is the model. Which means that the way that they write would, all of the writing that they created, they were all business documents, letters, correspondence, ledgers, all of their calculations about money, and all of their research about the interactions they had with the other Africans who were there. All of that was generated specifically for an economic purpose, which means that you really can't get at a lot of what Africans were doing there at this time, right? It's all mediated through the European eye and through the European pen. And then you have another layer on top of that, which is that each of these archives, the British National Archives, the Colonial Office, the National Archives of the Netherlands, etc., every single archive gets to decide for itself what is important enough to keep out of all the paperwork that was generated. And so documents that might have told us a little bit more about Africans might not have been important to archivists of 100, 200 years ago who were making decisions about how to spend their money, right? They have a budget. It costs a lot of money to store paper in good conditions and to buy that fire insurance and the sprinkler system and the air conditioning. All of that is really expensive. And so when you're making those decisions as an archivist 200 years ago, all of those archivists were Europeans. They were all white. And 200 years ago, they all thought about what will be important for other Europeans to have. And they tried to project into the future. So of course, they're not thinking about someone like you or me who's going in there to figure out like what happened to Africans. Like they didn't care what happened to Africans. And that is very visible in the way that those papers are treated. One example I'll give you is that when I went into the archives, I talked to the archivist about my project and I was like, so what do you recommend? How can you what should I look at first? And they were like, well, I mean, I don't know, like anything, take a look. And I was like, okay. And then as I was looking, I saw that every box had a list of keywords on it that archivists from like 100 years ago had decided these are the important topics that are covered by the documents in this box. Would you know, Black people are never on that keyword. Like there's no keyword related to Black people, or very few. Occasionally there were some African kings who the Europeans had to make deals with, and then those documents would be there, and they would be labeled like agreement with African king. But like any day-to-day stuff about engaging with the enslaved in the slave dungeons, none of that made it into the keyword because no one who archived those boxes 100 or more years ago thought that it would be important enough to make a keyword for someone searching in the future, because they could not imagine that anyone ever in the future would want to use those documents to search about Africans, right? So like that, you just have to think about like the systemic injustice there and how awful that is, because as a researcher coming in, you're like, okay, there are literally miles of boxes of information from each slave trading company. They've kept miles of records, like boxes lined up for miles. These warehouses inside the Amazon warehouses where all these documents are stored. The vast majority of those boxes, they have a little list where you've signed your name if you've looked at them. And so you can see who looked at them before you. And the vast majority of the boxes that I looked through, and I looked at less than 1% of what was there, the vast majority of the boxes there have no one listed on that list. So like that, the empty list was pasted there 100 years ago. Not a single person had looked into that box for 100 years. So like imagine the feeling of being the first person living to open this box to see what's there. And then everything I found about any African person, I realized like, there's no other information about this person. That it's just in this box right here. I'm the only person looking at it. And it's like that enormity of how unjust that is. How many people's lives are buried in those boxes that nobody has looked at yet because no one has thought of a way to do it, or no one has devoted the time or the energy to looking through those boxes and putting keywords in there to let people know where all the information about Africans and their descendants is. So I wanted to talk about that because that really helped to shape how I think about what sources we do have available. So I'm going to show you kind of a shocking slide now, not visually, just mentally shocking. For me, it was shocking anyway to see. So in 2020, J.D. Hacker did a study where he like literally counted up how many people were enslaved in just the US. So this is not a worldwide, it's just a US study. In this US study, he counted up, we had about 10 million enslaved people. He counted up what their average lifespans were and what they were expected to work in an average place of enslavement here in the US. So there's 410 billion hours of labor that came out of enslaved people to build this country. And those were uncompensated, right? Vastly uncompensated hours of labor. So again, when you see that compared to what's in the documents, it just becomes so starkly unjust that it is like, it's impossible to even have words to talk about how unjust all of that is. And so when in 2017, Fort Negley came under threat, I realized part of that threat, because I was still in the middle of doing this work in 2017. I'd finished my dissertation. I was sort of trying to wrangle my research into a book. And I saw that Fort Negley was going to be sold for condos. And I just like had the fury of 1,000 suns shining in me, because I realized the reason why is because all of the documents that talk about slavery in the US have been treated similarly. Like we're better, don't get me wrong, we are better than Europe in terms of how we treat our documents here when they pertain to Black Americans. And it's because we have so many Black Americans who've been advocating for like hundreds of years, right? But I knew that the reason why Fort Negley was being sold is because no one had taken the care to examine and collect all the documents surrounding this fort and to really show how this fort is really the genesis of the whole city of Nashville. Like how really any Black person who was in Nashville at the time had something to do with this fort, which means that most modern Black Nashvillians who've been here for a few generations, they belong with this population of people who helped build the fort and who helped defend it. And that was just a stark injustice that was so obvious to me after doing this work that I had to join the fight, right? Like I had no choice but to join the fight. And that caused my entire life to change. It really made me completely reflect, like, what am I doing trying to get back to Africa when we have problems right here that have to be solved? And so I changed my research. And I realized that with so much of the research, the problem really is that there's not enough information there about Black people because white people wrote it all and they just didn't know or care enough to write enough down. And so you have to look at other things, right? It means that you need to be incredibly aware of how you might get at information in other ways. And so for here in the US, again, we're fortunate because we do have that Black population here. And even when slavery was still in full boom, there were many freed Black people and a few enslaved Black people who were already collecting evidence, who were already writing it down, who were already passing things down, right? Like they were conscious of the fact that we would need to have evidence for everything that had happened. And so you have people like Olaudah Equiano and of course Frederick Douglass and Black people, Phyllis Wheatley, who like wrote down their recollections. You have some words of people of the Atlantic slave trade that are here, which is wonderful because that gives you like a really strong idea of what actually happened to Black people. How did they feel about it? What is the variety and diversity of experiences that were possible for Black Americans? All those things are really important and just not in the white literature, right? And then of course you also have the possibility of archaeology, which is really wonderful. Because a lot of these artifacts, they really speak for themselves. And in this corner here, this picture was taken just 3 days ago. So this is the anthropology lab at MTSU. And on the right is Chloe Cottle-Peacock. They are an archaeologist who are working for the company in New South. And on the left is Miss Janine Blackman, who's the CEO of the African American Cultural Alliance here. So Claylee has been working on the archaeology over at Bass Street next to the Science Center. And that neighborhood was where people after the Battle of Nashville, the Black soldiers settled right at the foot of this fort for safety, because this is where the military was, it would keep them safe. And so they formed a Black neighborhood. And then in the 1950s, the city raised it to make room for the interstate. So most of the neighborhood is now under the interstate, under I-40 and I-65, that interchange. But a part of that neighborhood is still there because it's part of the park. And so archaeologists have been doing some digging. And what I wanted was for the archaeologists to meet someone who had grown up in that neighborhood and to share what they could talk about the artifacts, because archaeologists, they can do research on the artifacts, right? They can tell you what each piece is, where it came from, who made it, or how it was made. But what a descendant can tell you is what that piece means to them, what memories they have associated with pieces like that. How did their grandmother use that piece? How did other people in the community use that piece? What value did they assign to that piece? And so we filmed them for almost 2 hours, just sharing knowledge. It was really wonderful to see. And I'm going to edit that footage and put it up because I think the world needs to see that this is how archaeology should be done, right? Like, I just feel very strongly that white people should never do projects about Black people, only with Black people. It's really important. And the archaeologists thankfully feel the same way. And so we've been working with descendants this whole time, kind of trying to make meaning of the space and of what's being found there. So with archaeology, with oral histories, which is the other picture there in the top left. So that's me doing work with the Fort Negley Descendants Project. I'm recording Bill Radcliffe there, who's like one of our, along with Gary, one of the USCT who come here all the time to do historical interpretation of the space. And this is me and one of my assistants, Juliet, recording his story, because if you can't have the words of the enslaved, having the descendants' words are second best, right? All right, so that is when I started to work with Fort Negley. And so just really briefly, the history of this space is that over on the Bass Street side, where that Science Center is, that used to be a contraband camp. Now, contraband was a word that I always put into quotes because it's kind of awful when you think about the connotation of that. But there was a Confiscation Act of 1861 and 1862, where, you know, when the southern states, some of the southern states came into rebellion, as they call it, they revolted, they had an insurrection, right? When that happened, the military and the nation decided, well, if you are part of that rebellion, then all of your things could be confiscated by the military. Like you don't get to have a say in that. And because at the time, legally, Black people were considered things, objects, that included enslaved people as well, of anybody who was in rebellion, which means that a lot of enslaved people found themselves suddenly being able to be confiscated, and they were very smart. They used the knowledge of that law to run away, because they knew that if they could make it to the nearest Union base or the nearest military fortification, the nearest military assembled group of people, that the military would have to keep them safe and would have to confiscate them, which means they'd be taken away from their enslaver and protected against re-enslavement by slave catchers. And so contraband is sort of a really tough word, because on the one hand, it connotates that someone is an object. And of course, that was never true. People are not objects, ever. On the other hand, a lot of enslaved people proudly took on that word because they would rather be the confiscated objects of the US military than be the objects of the enslaver. So there's a lot there, right? It's a lot of complicated stuff there. But over on the Bass Street side, that was a contraband camp. And they hid there in order to be, right, we have a quote here from Joseph Fowley, who was formerly enslaved. The contraband camps had to be guarded to keep the, quote, rebels from carrying them back to the white folks. So the people who were living at this contraband camp here at Fort Negley, before the fort was even built, they knew that there would be a gun guarding them against slave catchers. Right, so then when it was time to build, the Union military, I keep saying the Union military, it was our military, American military. Don't let me say Union, don't let me say federal, it was American military. The American military, they coerced these contraband people to build. Many people who were contrabands volunteered to build because they wanted to be useful and because they saw the Civil War as an opportunity. Many people saw it as many different types of opportunities, right? There's a lot there to talk about. Like, some people just saw it as an opportunity to get away from their enslaver, and that was good enough. Some people saw it as an opportunity to demand more from the country or to earn their citizenship through service with the military, because that's a tradition that is ancient, right? The Romans did that. The Romans said if you joined the military, you could become a citizen. And so this tradition is something that all Black people were aware of. It also existed in West Africa, right? If you were enslaved there, you could join the military. It's a way to work your way out of enslavement. So a lot of people knew the military is the way forward, right? At the same time, though, the military still had to force many people, so we don't want to gloss over that. There was also, as you can see from this, the military went into places of enslavement as well as places of worship and pulled Black people forcibly out and forced them to come here to build. So again, diversity of experiences. And from the database, we've been collecting the names of everybody that we know who's forced to build and who voluntarily built, and the free Black people who joined and built in exchange for a wage, because there was also a group of them. There was 4,933. You should also know that white Nashville was split about 50-50 during the Civil War, so only half of white Nashvillians were in favor of the rebellion. And so then if you look at all of Nashvillians in total, that brings that down to only about 30% of Nashvillians were in favor of the rebellion, right? All right, here is just some more images that I think are really evocative and important that sort of help you get an idea of the construction and also the geography of the space. That big image there that shows you the red line is the Union defense line. So they basically figured out that you have the Capitol building right in the middle, right? It's the same legislative building that we have now, right in the center. And then you build forts all around it in a semicircle to the south. And then in the north, the Cumberland River, of course, is a natural buffer of protection. Plus, there were boats, like naval boats were sitting in the Cumberland. And those boats were not segregated. Black people who joined the Navy, they were not segregated because you can't make separate facilities on a small boat. It's impossible. Right, so we had Black and white sailors who were protecting the line from the Cumberland, and then we had Black people who were building every single fort that went along that bottom. There were several. All right, and then Dr. Morton, who was the chief engineer who was in charge of building, he reported back about how the people had worked here. And he really showed that like they organized themselves. I think that's really important, right? Like it wasn't a bunch of white people providing the brain power and the fort schematics. It was one white engineer who made the schematics, and then he had Black project managers who would organize. Like the Black people organized themselves to work. They would elect someone to be the project manager, and that person would be the interface between them and the engineers. right? And like they knew how to do this already because they had already built the whole damn city, okay? Sorry, I don't have to tell you, like, I feel sometimes like so strongly about this, and then I realize like y'all already know, sorry. You guys know this, it's all the other people I speak with that don't know this, right? So then Fort Negley becomes finished December 7th, 1862. And then we have the Battle of Nashville. So many of the people who built Fort Negley were then either forced to or asked to join the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, which were the segregated regiments of our US military. And they fought in the Battle of Nashville. And actually, I think I have these slides backwards, so let's do this one here. And here's our friend Gary Burke. So yeah, so they joined the USCT. We had 8 regiments of USCT fight here. That means 13,000 Black soldiers who defended the city of Nashville. That is the largest African-American participation out of any Civil War conflict. And like by far, right? And I think that is super interesting because this was the point where you have a lot of Black volunteers who come from the North and they volunteer to go right back down into hell to free this country. This is the point in the Battle of Nashville where it's like a turning point. Once this battle is won, we know for a fact there's no way the Confederacy can win. And so what really happens is that a lot of Black people get together and decide, like, we can win this, and then we can demand something from the country that we helped, right? Like, we can show that we can do everything a free white man can do. So then why should we be enslaved? All right, so then we had Battle of Nashville. Fort Negley, we should point out, never actually seized the battle because it was built too strong and too tall and too big to even, people did not even dare to come here. So its purpose was really as a deterrent. Because if you think about a map of Nashville, you've got right in the center, the Capitol building, then you have Fort Negley right to the south, right? If you were going to attack from the south, you would have to go straight through Fort Negley to get a straight shot at the Capitol. But there was no way in hell anyone was going to do that. Like even General Hood, who was coked out of his mind with a missing arm, would not have dared to do that because you wouldn't win. You can't siege a castle. Fort Negley was a castle, right? And so that means that the Confederates had to go the pincer formation around the sides and attack, like over on Granbury's Lynette over here, and then over here where Costco is, right? So they attacked along the Cumberland River. And that was also very dumb because they're right in view of the ships, and they got fired from the ships, and then they got hit by the Black soldiers. It was a mess, right? Like they lost so bad. But also a lot of Black soldiers lost their lives because they did not have equal training. They did not have like equal treatment in the military. And so we had more deaths on the Black soldier side than on the White side. All right, so that brings me to the database. So then when I was thinking about this database, it was really fortunate that I met, so this is how I became involved with AAHGS. I met Tania, and we were talking about this Descendants Project, right? And like how people knew that they were descended from this space. And I thought like, well, how do people know? Like, I don't actually understand how people could know because I had never thought about the documentary trail because I am not Black, so I've never had to do that research before. And so I'd never really considered, like, if you were a Black person, what would you have to do to know that you belong to Fort Negley? And you know, Sophia, of course, was like, well, I have an entire presentation about that. And so we filmed her doing the presentation because she's just a really amazing resource. And then we talked about like what documents do Black Americans use to figure this stuff out? And is there a way to collect those documents? Like, can we make them searchable? Can we make it so that when you find an ancestor, you click on that ancestor and then it'll tell you who they were enslaved alongside, who was their enslaver, who fought with them in the same regiment. You know, like, could we do that? And she's like, well, I don't see why not, right? Like, it's doable. It's just no one had done it before. And that was not true. I shouldn't say that. No one had done it. No one had done it at scale before. So like so many people here in Nashville had already done some of that research, right? Like you of all have already done a lot of that research. And a lot of people in like the public history space have done a lot of that research. So we have like Fletch Koch over at the cemetery. We had Chuck Sherrill over at the TSLA. We had Carter Newton over at the Tennessee Central Railroad. All of them independently have been collecting information because they thought there really should be a database. Like, why is there no database? So they've all been collecting it, but they didn't have like the financial support to like create a database, right? So I wrote some grants and started looking at it. I'll get back to this one because I want to first share with you this page. I think this is probably the most interesting page. So we sort of surveyed people of Nashville who know stuff. And fortunately, Nashville's a great city because everybody knows stuff. Everyone thinks they don't know, and then you get them talking, and then they know, right? And so what we did is we asked them, like, what records exist that point to the existence of Black people participating in the Civil War? Where would you find that? And I was surprised at some of the answers people gave, things I hadn't even considered because I'm not trained as an Americanist, I'm trained in Africa, right? And so, for example, Chuck Sherrill told me, well, if you want to know more information about the USCT who fought here, a ton of them were incarcerated in the Tennessee State Penitentiary for insubordination. So if you look there, you're gonna find more information about them. And I would have never thought to check the prison records. It's not something I would have ever considered to do, right? And then, Fletch Coke, she was like, oh, there was also an undertaker here. He was very unusual because he buried both Black and white people. And that generally in the South doesn't tend to happen. It tends to be quite segregated in death for some reason. Well, for many reasons. And then, of course, someone over at Fisk, Delisa Myra Harris, who's the librarian over there, she said, oh, have you looked at Ophelia Settle Egypt's autobiographical accounts? Like, she went and interviewed enslaved people, and she was a Black interviewer, so they gave her a little bit more than they would have given the white folks in the WPA who were interviewing formerly enslaved people. So, like, from all of these ideas, I began to collect. And so I accepted research that other people had already done, so I didn't have to do it all myself. And then I went and did research on the things that hadn't been done yet. And essentially we spent years taking all of these documents here and like typing them into a spreadsheet all nice and organized, and then creating lists of all of the things that were talked about. So like I didn't know exactly how it would look, but I was really fortunate that I could hire someone who knows what they're doing, like someone who makes databases for a living and who was very good at understanding the problems that humanists like me have when we think about data. Because in a database, things have to be exact. You can't have fuzzy things. Like it either has to be yes or no. Like what race are they, Black or white? Like Black, white, or you could have like words like mulatto, octoroon, all of those historical words that we use. But you can't have something more complicated than that. And sometimes in the documents, it's more complicated than that, right? And so it becomes a little bit of a struggle, but together we worked with Tania and a host of descendants who we have on our team. Yeah. So we use the advisory board to run these tough questions by. And so it was really useful. Lee Williams especially was just wonderful because we were able to say like, look, we found this in the documentation. We think this is the same person, but I'm just not sure. I can't prove it either way. How should we enter that in the database? And then we would have a conversation about it. Ms. Janine also, like everyone on this advisory board is just so useful in helping me think through what are the consequences of my decisions regarding what goes into a database and how I put the database together. Because the last thing I wanted to do was perpetuate even more erasure, even more burying of truth, of facts, of people, right? These are human beings who live these really full lives. And right at about now, we have almost 19,000 Black people in the database who are all in some way related to Nashville's Civil War effort in Fort Nedley. And then we have about 2,500 to 3,000 white enslavers who are attached to them in some way. We put them in the database too, because as you know, here in Tennessee, we are all one people and our history is intertwined. This is not a separate Black history, right? Like when you look at the history of slavery, it's people who look like me who are doing the enslaving, and therefore it's my history too. And so we kind of think of it as like a holistic history. It's really important to bring those histories together, even if it makes a few people uncomfortable. I think we gotta work with that discomfort. We can't ignore it. And then all of the people here listed under a debt of gratitude are all the people who just like handed me their research or who knew something or who had stuff in their attics who were like, oh, I know something. And it was just so like lovely to get so much information from locals who trusted me to really to show it properly, right? To treat it properly. And I really learned a lot from many different people, and I came to really appreciate what it is that we have here in Nashville. I think for so long I didn't know, even though I'd lived here. And I think that's really common. I'm sure, Miss Natalie, you hear that every day. People are like, oh, I didn't know when they come here. There's so much that you just don't get to know because so much research just hasn't been done yet. But we're doing it. We're doing it all. All right, so get to the database. You just go to buildersanddefenders.org. It's finished now, by the way. We just finished it at the end of the year. And I'm just like so relieved to like have it be done. I say done, it's never done. Of course, if we discover more people, we might, right? Like you can never be done because we just don't know. Like we don't know when there was a contraband camp, we don't know who was born there. Surely some people were born there, right? Like we don't know every single person, but this is the most complete list as of now that everyone in Nashville knows about. And if someone knows about something else, like please have them find me. Like I want to put it in. So we'll keep growing with this. I consider this like a life work. So if there's more discoveries of people, we'll put them in. We'll make sure that they are also searchable in the database. And so when you go to the database, this is a nerdy page. If you're not nerdy, don't worry about it. But I sort of want to show you how the process works now. So in the beginning, we merged all of these spreadsheets, but now if we have just small amounts of people, like say you went into your attic and you found a letter from someone that mentioned an enslaved person and you don't find it in the database, then you're like, huh, okay. Well, we could take that letter and I could use this form to type in all of the things. So I could type in like, what was their name? What was their marriage status? When did they die? When did they live? What sex were they? What relationships were mentioned? So if the letter mentions like, oh, you know, I had an enslaved daughter, Gabby, and her brother, John, then I would make an entry for Gabby and I would put down everything we know about Gabby. And then I would, under relationships, put down John, and then I would make a separate entry for John, put down everything we know about John, and under relationships, put down Gabby. That way, when you type in John or Gabby to search, it all pops up. So you can see, like I've put in John, but here, now Gabby pops up too, so I can click on Gabby too. Because relationships are deeply important, and that's something that I didn't decide. That was decided by a group coming out of Harvard and Michigan State University, and they have a bigger database called Enslaved. So if you go to enslaved.org, what they did is they have this ambitious idea of creating one database to rule them all, essentially. So one database that would absorb the data of every other database about any person who was enslaved or the descendant of an enslaved person. And so they are absorbing everything and making it searchable using 3 criteria. So like the name, the event that they're related to, and the people that they're related to. And that's why we did that too. Like we wanted to make sure that every single person in our database had at least those 3 points, because then they absorbed our data. So now all of our data is sitting also in enslaved.org. So when you type in anybody's name from there, it'll also show you if those names connect to any other database in the world that has also been absorbed by enslaved.org. It doesn't quite work as well as you would think yet. Like they're still working on it. This is still like an early phase, but I just felt so strongly that like if something happens to me, if something happens to Vanderbilt, if this database goes away for some reason, it shouldn't, but if it does, that there's another place where it's sitting. So it's not gonna go away. Like, and then this is my favorite part of it. So if you go to the mapping part, and there's like at the top, there's like a menu, so you can just go and see everything. The mapping page allows you to basically any name that we found that has an associated place with it, we put it into this database to allow it to be mapped. And so basically like any birth date, and if there's a birthplace, we put that birthplace into the map. For all the soldiers, we put the place where they enlisted, we put the place where they died, we put the place where they were born, were said to have been born in their military records. All the places people were enslaved are there. And so when you look at everybody, so everybody who was Black, who was involved in the Battle of Nashville, this is where they come from. And I love this map so much because it proves Lee Williams's hypothesis correct, right? Like back when Fort Negley was under threat, he said, to help white people understand, he said, look, Fort Negley is essentially the Ellis Island for Black folks. And that's something that has always stuck with me because Ellis Island is a thing that all white people gravitate towards. That's a thing we understand intrinsically, right? Like my family also passed through Ellis Island. So like to think about that is like, oh, if we think about Fort Negley in those terms, what does that mean? Well, now we map out everybody who came to participate in the building of the fort or who defended it in the Battle of Nashville or who was otherwise involved with the Civil War, who was Black, is mapped out. And you can see that we come from everywhere, right? So Nashville's Black population is super diverse. It comes from the entire eastern half of the country, right? As far west as Texas, as far north as Providence, Rhode Island, down in Florida, like we've got everything. But then of course, also what's interesting is that as can be expected, right? Along the Mississippi River, there's a big swath. That makes sense because people next to a river have better opportunities for escape, for running away. It makes sense as well that along the Appalachian Mountains we have, because in Tennessee, it was really East Tennessee that was very firmly against the Civil War. Like they really wanted to remain with the Union. That's also where you get coal country. That's also where you get the Union aesthetic, right? Like, so there, that makes sense as well. But then there's some places where that don't make as much sense to me. And I think that's really interesting because I had this thought in my head of what is true And then I see the map and I'm like, it doesn't quite match up. And that's I love that. Like, that's really wonderful. And that just helps everyone to remember how diverse it really is. And I think that's something they have to keep remembering. Like, there was no Black monolith here. Like, this was one of the most diverse Black communities in the entire country. And so then I'll go to the one I skipped over, which is the viewpoints. So I work with a ton of white people because Vanderbilt is primarily white. We have a term like the PWI. Some people call it persistently white university, also true. We laugh, but it's true. It's just true, right? And so when I work with students, the vast majority of students I work with are white, right? That is a part of it. So we have to be very careful. And fortunately, a lot of the descendants I work with, a lot of the people in Nashville are really useful at helping to bring these students, orient them in the right direction. But we also have this viewpoints, which is sort of like our mission statement, and I make students read that. And I'm like, if you don't agree with this, we can't work together. It's really important that you agree with this. If nothing else, this is the thing. So this project is created with the presumption that descendant voices deserve to be centered in discussions of interpretation of the site of Fort Negley and its history. The database, therefore, was created with the understanding that digital projects have ethical responsibilities to center this community as subject matter experts and generators of knowledge, rendering the process a co-creation. The database believes that the history of slavery and of freedom is our shared history. Everyone in the United States lived with this legacy, though the burdens of this legacy are not shared equally. Black people experienced the Civil War in many ways, and we honor those differences. We honor the people who were forced to build and defend the UNESCO site of memory, Fort Negley, as we honor those who participated willingly in the search of freedom for themselves and their descendants. We honor those who paid the ultimate price in the fort's construction and defense. Say their names, for now they are in one place. Great. Almost done, folks. And I just wanted to share also that as part of all this work, of course, the question I always get is like, what about students? How can students use this? Well, how can they learn? Like, people are really excited about getting students involved in primary sources, which is what's so important because kids identify more with something if it feels real. And Fort Negley's in their backyard. And so this is like the genesis of our city's modern history. Like, Fort Negley's population are our ancestors, right? So like, we've hired some people at the database to create lesson plans. And here, this one is the most recent one that's been added. We have about 6 or 7 different lesson plans, which is really important. This one was created by someone who has worked as a public school teacher first. And actually they were teaching in Ferguson when Mike Brown was killed. So like, they have a very strong understanding of how to teach holistically about race and history, especially. And she is Black also herself. And so she created these lesson plans, which can be as short as 2 weeks, or it can be an entire 6-week unit. She created a free reading booklet, which contains primary source information by both Confederate and Union sources. We did that because Confederates really like to tell of themselves. And they'll tell you that the war was about slavery. Like, there are many, many Confederate sources that say exactly that, so we included those. And all of the lessons that we have, there's like a slideshow, there's a student workbook, there's a reading book. All of these things follow Tennessee standards. And so we laid out exactly which Tennessee standards are met during every single lesson, so that to help teachers form not a defense, because they don't want to make it combative, but to arm teachers with the information they need in case parents have a problem with what's being taught. And this month, I'll be speaking at the Williamson County Educator Institute. So it's a big group of public school teachers from Williamson County, where I'm going to hand them all these lesson plans and explain how to use them, how to address speaking with parents and students about this, and really how to come to a more modern understanding of what happened here, of the Civil War, of race, of slavery, all of that. Because I believe that anyone at any age and any ability can grasp this. It's not complicated, it just requires a reorientation. All right, and then I wanted to point out 2 resources. So I know I talked a lot, and it's a lot, but here are 2 things that you can take with you, or not take, because it's available on your computer already or on your phone. So if you go to YouTube, there's the Fort Negley Descendants Project name, and that's where we have all of our video content as well as on the database. And so this video, one of my research assistants, Jessica Fletcher, made, and she basically takes you through the whole database and explains to you what you got to click, what you got to put in, how to search, like every, so in case you're like kind of struggling or wondering, like, how would I like take me through a search, like use this video please, because she does a really great job of just like explaining how you would search and how you can understand what you find as like your results, right? And then this video, I love this one the most. So this is our own Tania Kuntz, and this is Destiny Hanks, who was one of my research assistants as well. Now she works for Susan Coleman, but we got her back as one of the media people for the Friends of Fortnightly. So I'm not gonna let her go because I think she's also a descendant, and she thinks so too. She just hasn't done the research. I'm not gonna push her, she'll do it when she's ready. But in this video, Tania talks Destiny through how would you know if you were a descendant or not. So please share that with people who are looking to get into this history, who don't understand how the sources, the documents work, etc. So with these two videos together, you should have everything you need to sort of figure out if your ancestors were in the database too. And that is all I have. I think from here we're going to look over the little brochure that Natalie is thinking of offering at the visitor center about this database. And then also if you'd like to buy a copy of the book, I have some here. They're $25. I can take cash. I also have PayPal or Venmo, but also honestly, Amazon sells them for a little bit cheaper. So here they're 25, on Amazon they're 21 right now, they're on sale. So like if you want to wait for Amazon, I am not going to be mad. Or if you just don't want one, not going to be mad. But thank you so much, everyone. That was lovely.
Take questions.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot about that.
Anyone?
Absolutely, yeah, I'll take any questions you have. And while you're thinking of your questions, please connect with me on social media. I'm like super active, especially on TikTok and Instagram. Those are my favorites. Twitter is super combative. Why are people so angry there? But on TikTok and Instagram, people are super supportive and lovely. I also make little videos to sort of explain what I'm doing, and whenever I find something new, I try to make a video to share with people, because it's one of the best ways I can sort of get to younger people as well and to kind of like help them see what's going on. And that's been such a blast. I've connected with so many people on there. Actually, yesterday I connected with a woman who had an artifact that belonged to an enslaved person in South Carolina. And she was asking like, who should I give this to? And I was like, I will help you find a home for that. So it's really fun how you sort of get to meet people and hopefully change the way people think about some of the things. All right, so questions, please.
I have questions. You mentioned that there are white individuals in the database, and your website also talks about there are women in there. So I wonder, can you tell us more about how do you describe their experiences?
Yeah, so for those who didn't hear, Natalie asked, I mentioned in the database that there are enslavers in the database, white people, as well as women. And how can I talk a little bit more about who those people are and like how they got to be there, what their experience was? Yeah, so I'll start with women. There are white and black women in the database because there are quite a lot of women enslavers. That was actually really common. A lot of men, when they died, left their enslaved to their wives. And so many of the enslavers are women. And I wanted to keep that in the database because I really think it is important that we don't separate out the two populations. Most of us share an ancestry now because of the way that Tennessee works and because of the way that slave laws worked in terms of children, right? Like if children had any black DNA that was visible, they were considered black as well and they were eligible to be sold. A lot of white enslavers took advantage of that and they would sexually assault the women that they had enslaved, and then they would sell the children off because it made their wives angry. So yeah, it's really horrific and disgusting what happened here. And we don't talk enough about those things, but those things are a part of our history. This is how we became America, so we have to discuss it. So I kept the enslavers in, and you can search for them and find them. A lot of the names that you would suspect are in there. And yeah, and I think when it actually comes to enslavers, I'm pretty sure it's almost 50-50 women and men, which I think a lot of people wouldn't expect necessarily. But white women for sure have also done a lot of enslaving in this country. And then the black women, there's a wonderful book by Thavolia Glimpf, who was our speaker at the Friends of Fortnightly. We have every year a wonderful undergrad railroad lecture, and she came 2 years ago. She's a professor at Duke, and she was also like the president of the American Historical Association, and getting her here was a stroke of, we just had the right connections, honestly. She's way too famous for a place like this, but it was really wonderful to have her. So Thavolia Glimpf is her name, and she writes, the title has something freedom in it, but it's about women and children. Basically, she looks at refugeeism in the Civil War. She looks at essentially, you have it, the women's fight. Oh, that's one of them. Yes, she has multiple books. The Women's Fight, fully a glimpse, buy a copy. She's a genius. She pulls something out of nothing every time. But basically what she looked at was like how it affected women when there was the chaos of the Civil War. So like in the early 60s, 1860s, when the Confederate States decided to announce that they were seceding, it created a lot of instability. A lot of enslavers weren't sure if they wanted to remain or if they needed to flee further south to get away from the Union Army that was encroaching. And so what they did is they essentially, some enslavers left and just left the enslaved behind to manage the plantation or the household. And of course, the people left behind were like, I'm not staying here, because they were sitting ducks for military from both sides, right? So like the Black women's experience here is one of, it's horrible. Like essentially women were sexually assaulted by soldiers, both American soldiers and Confederate soldiers, like who saw them as free game if there was no enslaver around to say otherwise. And so many women and children fled at this time. They all heard that you have to go to the military, flee to the military. If you can get to a base, they have to protect you. And so here at the contraband camp over on Bass Street, we had many women who were part of that, and many women also labored. And that's something that is only recently discovered because of the Boyle-Willis research. And I found that to be true too. When I looked at the list of laborers that were listed, there were many women who were listed as working as laborers in the fort. And when I published on this for the Journal of Slavery and Preservation, I got a reviewer back who said, no, that can't be. There's no women or children ever were forced to work by the military. And I was like, sir, I have a list. Do you want to see it? We got into it a little bit, but the journal allowed me to keep it in when I showed them the evidence, because not only were women forced to build, children were forced to build too, right? The youngest boy who was forced to build here was Moses McGavick, and he was just 12 years old. And of course, back then, right, like white people had, and we still have sometimes, difficulty telling the age of Black people. So a 12-year-old boy can become a man in some white eyes. And that is dangerous. It's dangerous now in terms of police, right, in terms of how we treat children. It was dangerous back then as well in terms of, hey, you're old enough to go build this fort, right? Imagine being 12 years old and carrying these big blocks of stone and building a fort with insufficient food, right? Awful. So that's sort of, these are the women that are in the database for the most part. And I think there might be a couple more in terms of like bodies being processed by the undertaker and incarcerated women. In fact, we have one woman, her name was Susan Contraband. She gave her name as Susan Contraband, and I thought that was so interesting because this whole time I was, in my head, I was thinking like, that's so offensive. Like, but then she was proud to be contraband because it meant that she had claimed herself. She had stolen herself. She got away from her enslaver, and she had determined her own future. So she was happy to be like, I'm Susan Contraband. That is my new name. And I kind of love that for her. Like, good for you, Susan. But she was incarcerated because, I don't remember, but some kind of insubordination related crime that is not a real crime, which is what most of the Black people in the penitentiary were in there for. Yeah, any other questions?
How many total names in the database?
Total names in the database. So I think in total we have about 23,000 almost. Yeah, so almost 19,000 Black, and everyone else is white. And everyone who's mixed goes into the database as Black, even though you can see, like, we leave the racial designations in, but for the sake of search, anyone who is not white is considered Black.
Dr. Sutton, could I ask you to stop sharing your slides so we can, all right, cool. We do have some questions online we can ask as well.
Oh, I've lost the ball.
Okay.
Okay, okay.
So that may be internet connection there because
What's the problem?
We don't have any more sound.
oh, there she's still
Oh,
there.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Okay. So now, so I wish we could, it would be great if we had the resources to do genealogy research on more of the people in the database, because some of them were changing their names, as you were saying. Once you find the name, I would imagine maybe someone tried to file a pension on that person later on, mentioned it in the pension, and so that might have some, provide some more information about that person. But it's a wealth of information that you have put together And it's just a very valuable resource for African American research.
Thank you.
African American research in Nashville.
Did you
Anyone
all
can
hear that online? Can you hear the
I can
question?
hear some, yeah. So yeah, we can hear some.
Great. Yeah, Natalie just has really great ideas about like other places where this research could lead or could connect to, because obviously pension records would sort of be an obvious next step.
Mhm.
There's all I can think there's so many other things I could do. Gosh,
Thank you, Dr. Sutton, for building that.
of course.
That's a very important resource. A couple of questions. Is that a complete list of all of the people who built the fort? Or you continue adding names? That's question one. And question two is, you mentioned a video you would go to see how to do it. Is that in the brochure?
That is in the brochure.
Okay.
Yeah. So two questions. The first was, is everybody in there, or are we still adding? And the second one is, I mentioned a video. Where is that? So the first one is like, it's as complete as it can be in that everyone that we currently know of, and I've asked professors, I've asked public historians, I've asked descendants, I've asked everyone who works with these records, like what else could there be? So I think I'm aware of all the sources that currently exist that talk about the people who were building here and who were fighting here, and they are all in. So it is as complete as it can be now. But I never want to say it's completely done, because when it comes to information of Black people, or any people really, there's always more that gets discovered. There's always a dusty box somewhere. For example, the records of the Tennessee Central Railroad, the employment records, are in this database. That was not part of the plan originally, but what had happened was that as I was working, Carter Newton came up to me, and he's the volunteer archivist of the Tennessee Central Railroad. If y'all ever go, it's just a train museum. It's got beautiful trains. You can ride a train. There's all these train parts. A lot of people who go are like mechanical sort of oriented people. But Carter's like the nerdy guy who's up in the top in the attic, just like cataloging away the papers. And this document, this whole host of documents is not available to the public yet because he hasn't finished cataloging them all. But when he heard that I was doing this work, he introduced himself. He was like, hey, I heard that you're working on Bass Street. You'll never guess what happened. I saw some of the oldest employment records from the Tennessee Central Railroad, and a lot of those workers from like the 1890s, the 1910s, they gave their address as Bass Street. Do you want to see? And I was like, do I want to see? So my research had to derail because I spent a couple of months up with Carter, just like in the attic of the Tennessee Central Railroad, looking through those employment records. And I was like, we need to put this here. So even though you can't see the original yet because those haven't been made public yet, you can see at least that they're there. And Carter did say, like, if anyone's looking for their family, and if you find them there, he'll take you. For a special appointment, you can go in and see. So like, he's very open about wanting people to access that. It's on Lafayette, so like really close to Fort Negley, the Tennessee Central Railroad.
Are you saying that if you had an ancestor who worked on the railroad?
On the Tennessee Central, yeah, because there were multiple railroads that came from here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but if you have an ancestor and you can find in the database, like it says, it comes from the TCR records. Since those are not accessible anywhere except in that attic, Carter will take you there. So like, he's not going to try to keep you from anything. It's just it takes a long time. He's only one person, so he hasn't been able to archive it yet. And the video I was mentioning is the how-to video that is on our YouTube channel. Just type in Fort Negley Descendants Project onto YouTube, and all those videos will pop up. It's the latest one. And then there are also multiple links to it everywhere in the database, because we wanted to make sure people could access that.
Thank you very much for this database. I have a journal from a slaveholder, and I knew some of his slaves had served and listed over laborers. But in your list, I found a slave I didn't know about, Jack Cummings.
Oh my
And
goodness.
he's listed under.
But yeah, please say it to the microphone, because I think
Yeah,
everyone hears
because we
one.
can't hear it. Kind of. Sorry.
Under the enslaver D. Graham.
Wow.
So thank you.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm so happy to hear that. Wow, so we already have people in this room who've been using.
Yes, I didn't hear what you said. My father purchased a slave journal, and over the years, we kept looking at it. What's this? When I wanted to start research on my family of slaves, I didn't know how to start. So I said, Dad, may I look at this journal? We just thought it was a book someone made up. And it's in Nashville, Rutherford County, and Davidson County, and his name was Daniel Brown. Well, fortunately, he was the Secretary of State, so we have lots of records and documents. But we have his journal, and every page for the slaves, you have your name, who he purchased them from, the amount he paid. But every year, they had one or two sentences as to what they were doing. Now, that's it. She had the birth, the date of birth, she married, she worked here, she did that. So this just helps fill in the story, your database.
Oh, that's so wonderful to
So
hear.
thank
Wow.
you.
No, you're so welcome. I'm so happy that you could find your ancestor there.
Graham Slave Records.
Okay, GRAHAM,
Mm-hmm.
slave records, okay, interesting.
Could you repeat that again?
Graham.
And if I can pipe in, Kanetta was on Antiques Roadshow talking about this journal. So I've shared the link in the chat for the people online to be able to see that discussion. And we can share that in email afterwards. So thank you, Kanetta, for sharing your discovery.
Hey, the computer is about to die. We're out of battery. Is there a way to plug it in? Can we ask
Yeah.
Tracy? Sorry, I just don't want to
Okay, yeah.
disappear on y'all.
Let me ask you a
Another
question. Sorry.
Yeah, first, and then we'll get to you. Okay, go ahead.
Your enslaved.org database, does that interact with Canada and perhaps Mexico?
Yes, so enslaved.org is global, and so they have a ton from Canada, from Mexico. I think the strongest things right now, actually they have a lot from Mexico, a ton from Cuba as well, some from Angola, a lot from Spanish Florida. So a lot of it comes from the Slave Society's digital archive, which is where I worked before I did this work. Yeah, so enslaved.org, it's really worth a look. I know that they haven't gotten to where they want to be and they're very frustrated by that, but it is really an amazing initiative, and I'm confident that over time they will get to where they want to go. But it's really important to have that global perspective, right? Like America was not this isolated monolith. Oh, there we go. Okay, we have power.
Has there been any kind of interaction with, because I understand that there's a dispute about Arab enslavers centuries ago participating in slave trade. Has there been any investigation of that?
I'm sure there has. I don't pay as much attention to it because Arabs tended to traffic in the eastern part of the globe, so there isn't as much that ends up in the Atlantic world, but some does. There's a few scholars who are looking into that. All right, Tania, did you have a question?
Yeah, we have some questions from people online. So Joan asked, in the Fort Negley builders documents, how are the coerced versus volunteer builders listed?
So it's not completely clear, which has been the beat of my existence, right? Some of the ways that we can tell who is coerced versus who is a volunteer is looking at who is listed with an enslaver. Because if you are listed with an enslaver, that means that either you were taken from that plantation or that place of enslavement and forced to build, and the military kept record of who the enslaver was because the idea was after the war they would be returned. Or you were with an enslaver because some enslavers volunteered to loan out the people that they enslaved to the military in exchange for money. And in fact, those enslavers tried to sue the military afterwards, so they didn't get their money. And there was a whole host of letters back and forth between the soldiers who had supervised the enslaved here and DC, where they were fighting over who should get the money involved in payments, who deserves the payments. So we don't 100% know, but chances are if they're listed with an enslaver, there's less of a chance that they went voluntarily.
Okay.
Do you have if they enlisted with the USCTs, do you have that military record?
Yeah.
A full on, okay.
We do. So she asked, if they enlisted with the USC, if any of the laborers enlisted in the USCT, do we have the record? Yes. So we know that everybody who was a laborer first here at Fort Negley and then was enlisting in the USCT, all enlisted in the same unit, in the 12th. So it's all one unit, which makes it so much easier. So we just grabbed all the records from the 12th and imported them and made sure that they were part of the database. So we have a list of people who both were laborers and who served in the 12th. And I think there's maybe 400-ish, or maybe fewer, maybe 300-ish that are there. You would think there'd be more, but they were only able to enlist the able-bodied, healthy male. And by the time the forts were done building, that's all that was left. It was a stark time.
Dr. Sutton, yes, let me ask another question from online. Susan is asking, do you have any book talks planned where your book can be purchased in person?
I don't, but I'm always open to, if you know someone who wants a book talk, if you're with any people who run bookstores or clubs, I'm so happy to give more talks. So like if you've got a club or a church or a group that would want to host me, I'll come and I can sell books there for sure. That'd be fun.
Cool. And we have another question left, if I can ask it. Regarding unmarked graves around Fort Negley, is there a DNA ID project going on or planned? And how will participants or descendants participate in that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's such a can of worms. So we've only recently sort of discovered where those unmarked graves are. We are not sharing that information with the public for obvious reasons, but we've shared it with the landscape architects who are helping to develop this park, because obviously we don't want them to run into any bones. There's also a political consideration that if we for sure find bones at Fort Negley, that affects the way Parks is able to either participate in the renewal of the park that's coming, and also in the way that Parks has to categorize this space. So it could hold up a lot of the progress that we've been making. And so as of now, we've run some ground penetrating radar to kind of look through some of the places where, from the documents, we think that those bodies could be. And the radar has confirmed the existence of what they say, quote, looks like limb pits. And the limb pit is like a scientific term, like, limbs, like your arms, is like a pit of all kinds of human remains mixed together. And the reason for that is because, so we have one space where we think laborers were buried who died, because there were 800 deaths during the construction of this place. But then also after the war, many people who were killed in the Battle of Nashville, their bodies were brought here to Fort Negley because we're right on the railroad. And so they forced the soldiers, the Black soldiers who worked here, to sort through the bodies and put the claimed bodies onto the railway lines so that they could be taken back home to their families to be buried. But not everybody was claimed. And so the people who went unclaimed, Black, white, Confederate, and American soldiers, they were all buried in one mass pit. And they were kept there until the US military came in and created our Veterans Cemetery over in Madison. So, in Gallatin Pike, we've got that national cemetery where all those white military headstones are. When that was built, then the soldiers exhumed most of those bodies and put them into the national cemetery with their proper gravestone. But not everybody was moved, because not everybody was able to be identified. And also the ground has shifted since they were put in. And so we're pretty certain that there are still some people from that process also left on the park. So we've decided that until a descendant specifically comes forth and says, hey, I think that my ancestor is here and I have some pretty good proof, we're going to leave it be and let people rest where they are. But I think that if someone were to come forward with some pretty convincing evidence that their ancestor is there, I think that would be a different conversation. We'd have to open that discussion again.
What is the Fort Negley traveling trunk?
So we've already got people looking through the leaflet, and she asked, what is the Fort Negley traveling trunk? So that was something that one of our students at Belmont created, which I think is just so smart. You know how when you have a museum or something, and they have these programs for homeschoolers where there's a trunk of stuff they give you, and you can use them as props to teach things. And so this student at Belmont decided that she would create something similar where everyone could create their own traveling trunk. And so she described artifacts that you can buy on, or replicas that you can buy pretty cheaply online and create a trunk for, and then different exercises that students can do that involve all of their senses so that they can learn about those artifacts. And Mr. Berg, his picture is in that trunk, as well as some other things they teach you how to make some hard text. You can talk about what soldiers were eating and how, was that nutritionally enough or not? There's all kinds of different activities in there, there's word searches and things, and it's for very young students to sort of get an introduction into Civil War history so that they can be ready when they go into school.
We're getting a little past our time, so I want to say, first of all, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it. It's great. Thank you so much.
encourage my colleagues here in AAHGS Nashville to continue to support the database because it's here
Yes.
for us to use and to create stories, to find stories of these people. And it's gonna require ongoing work. So I wondered from those of you who have listened to the presentation today, and those of you online as well, how many of you would be interested in working on perhaps well, first of all, let me ask, Tania, the Black Heritage project that you're doing that looks at Black history
Yes.
in states, do we have a branch that looks at Fort Negley?
So we haven't yet, and that's something that we need to add this coming year, is to make sure we have Fort Negley represented, highlights of the enslaved experiences there, links to the Builders and Defenders database, and the resources that you put together, Dr. Sutton. So yeah, that's something we need to do this year.
I think that would be fantastic support to show how much we appreciate this resource, use and showing that we were able to find this and that from this database. It was very, very valuable in preserving the African American history of Nashville. So I would challenge my colleagues to let's form a committee as part of the Black Heritage Project that Tania is doing. She's doing the Black Heritage Project. I won't spend a lot of time on it now, but perhaps on the next time that we meet, we can discuss creating a committee branch of the Wiki Tree Black Heritage Project that looks at Fort Negley, that looks at the builders and defenders and the database.
That would be amazing.
You think that would be worth it, you think? Oh, yeah. There's a lot of information there. So were there any other questions online?
I think there was one more online. Let me share that. Okay, Joan says, though few, as you noted, what African kings and queens were specifically mentioned in the European archives regarding the piracy history?
Sorry, repeat the question. I lost
Okay,
that first half.
sorry. Though few, as you noted, what African kings and queens were specifically mentioned in the European archives regarding the piracy history?
Yeah, there were quite a surprising amount, and the way that they were mentioned is really difficult to find because, of course, no one is, there's no document that at the top says, Duchess of Gillespie, for example. But as you read someone's account, like for example, in my book, I use one of the sources that I use that doesn't come from a slave trader, it's like the only one, is the source of the surgeon who traveled with that naval general or with that naval captain, Challoner Ogle. And this surgeon was named John Atkins, and he kept a diary every day on the ship because it gets boring on a ship if you're not fighting or dying. So he would keep a journal every day, and he would mention to chase this pirate down, they essentially stopped at every single place in Africa that had some settlement on the coast. Because they were asking, right? They were asking after him. They're like, have you seen this pirate? Like, essentially, like the wanted poster. Have you seen this pirate? They came to every African settlement, and in those African settlements, they came to learn like who's in charge right now. They would always ask because it was something that changed so rapidly. Because there was like so much volatility on that coast. Europeans had introduced so much violence and so much just instability that whoever the leader was changed a lot. So that this guy would actually write down who the leaders were each time he went up a small river or into an inlet. And so from there, every time I find one, I put it into the book. So we had like King Pedro, we had the Duchess of Gillespie, we had King Pedro's son, because King Pedro was like very determined that his son would also be recognized by the Europeans as a king so that he could get in on some of that trade. So you'll get a few of them in the book.
All right. So Joan, get the book. Yes. She's raising her hands. That's great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sutton. I want to share with you a comment from LaToya. She wants to compliment you on your reading. Your voice supported the story that you intended to reflect. So we appreciate you reading through your book. We appreciate the information you shared with us, especially about the database. We're going to do our part to help promote it and continue to raise this awareness. And Nallie's doing great work there with the fort and this to make sure visitors to the fort know about it too. So it's excellent.
Oh, thank you so much. This is excellent. I just love an opportunity to always reflect on like, why am I doing what I'm doing? Is it actually useful? Because I don't want to be working in a void. I want to do projects with people who want projects done so that we we can make some use, right? So we can get our history out there.
Yeah. So thank you. All right, I'm gonna stop the
Always
recording
welcome.
now, but then we can, chit chat until then.